Millionaire goes to a restaurant and orders something special, but what he sees makes his heart race. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Emily Carter felt the weight of the entire day pressing down on her shoulders as she wiped down the last table in the restaurant. Her feet throbbed inside her worn-out sneakers, and her uniform reeked of nothing but spilled coffee and fryer grease. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., and all she wanted was to go home, take a quick shower, and fall asleep next to her son. The restaurant, a small and cozy diner on a New York City corner, was nearly empty. Only a couple sat in the back, arguing in hushed voices, while Mike, the cook, scrubbed the grill. The manager had already left, leaving Emily in charge of closing the register and locking up for the night. She sighed. It had been a rough day. Customers seemed more demanding than usual, and the tips had been smaller. Noah needed a new pair of shoes, and the electric bill was overdue. The exhaustion burned in her eyes, but there was no time for self-pity. Her life had always been like this, a daily battle, a solitary fight. The chime of the door startled her, cutting through her thoughts. Emily turned, surprised to see someone walking in this late. A tall man in a dark suit stood at the entrance, his expression weary. His slightly disheveled brown hair suggested he'd run his fingers through it countless times throughout the day. His blue eyes swept over the diner before settling on her. "Are you still serving?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. Emily hesitated for a second. Technically, they were about to close, but something in his gaze stopped her from turning him away. There was a kind of exhaustion there that she knew all too well. "Yeah, of course. Sit wherever you'd like," she said, grabbing her notepad. He chose a stool near the counter, sinking onto it with a heavy sigh. Emily handed him a menu, but he didn't even glance at it. "What would you recommend?" he asked, looking up at her. The question caught her off guard. Almost no one ever asked for her opinion. "Well, if you're really hungry, the house burger is a great choice. But if you're in the mood for something lighter, we've got chicken and vegetable soup," she said, trying to sound professional. The corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest hint of a smile. "The soup sounds good. I think that's exactly what I need." Emily nodded and headed toward the kitchen, a strange warmth creeping up her skin. Something told her this wasn't going to be just another ordinary night. Emily ladled the steaming soup into a white bowl and placed it on a tray along with a spoon and a glass of water. As she walked toward the counter, she discreetly observed the mysterious man. His hands were clasped together on the table, his gaze distant, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. "Here you go," she said, setting the bowl in front of him. "Careful, it's hot." He lifted his eyes to hers, and for a brief moment, Emily felt as if he could see past her exhausted exterior. There was something deeper in those blue eyes, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you." His voice was sincere, as if he were expressing gratitude for more than just the food. Emily stepped away to give him space, but to her surprise, he didn't start eating right away. Instead, he picked up the spoon slowly, as if he were lost in thought. The silence in the diner was comfortable, almost intimate. Every now and then, as she organized the cash register and recorded the day's sales, Emily stole glances in his direction. The man ate slowly, savoring each spoonful like it was something rare. After a while, he wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked at her again. "Have you been working here long?" The question caught her off guard. Customers rarely showed interest in her life. "A few years," she replied, keeping it vague. "Do you like what you do?" Emily let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's not about liking it or not. It's what I have to do." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "James." He extended his hand, and Emily hesitated before taking it for a brief moment. "Emily." The touch was fleeting, but something unfamiliar rippled through her skin. A warmth, a sensation that felt like more than it should have been. "That was the best soup I've had in a long time," he said, placing a $50 bill on the counter before getting up. Emily's eyes widened. That's way too. Consider it a thank you, he interrupted, slipping on his jacket. See you around, Emily. And then he walked out, leaving behind a strange emptiness and the rapid pounding of her heart. The next night, Emily didn't expect to see him again. Men like James Donovan, because now she knew his name, didn't come to diners like this twice. And yet, when the chime above the door rang and she looked up, there he was. His suit was different, but the exhaustion in his expression was the same. He walked in unhurriedly, as if he had all the time in the world, and took the same seat as the night before. Emily took a deep breath before approaching. Well, look who's back, she said, trying to mask her nervousness. James lifted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I think I'm addicted to the soup. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. I call that an exaggeration, he chuckled, and for a brief moment, something inside her warmed at the sound. All right, you got me. I just needed a quiet place to have dinner. Hope you don't mind. Emily shook her head. I don't usually turn customers away, but we do have a full menu. Maybe you should try something new tonight. James tilted his head, considering her suggestion. What if I let you choose for me? Something you like? The question caught her off guard. Me? Yeah. I want to know what your favorite dish here is. Emily hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Well, the grilled cheese and tomato sandwich is my favorite. Simple but good. Sounds perfect. I'll have that. She nodded and walked away, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. He was different. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the stereotype of the distant, untouchable millionaire. When she returned with his plate, James waited until she was close before speaking. Tell me more about yourself, Emily. She frowned. Why? Because I want to know. His gaze was steady, unrushed, with no apparent ulterior motives. Emily took a deep breath. What do you want to know? James picked up the sandwich but didn't answer right away. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Did you always want to work here? She laughed, shaking her head. Of course not. But life doesn't always give us choices. And what did you want to be? Emily looked away. It doesn't matter anymore. The silence that followed was heavy. He didn't push, but she knew he hadn't forgotten the question. When he finished his meal, James left another generous tip and walked out with the same unhurried ease as before. Emily watched as he disappeared down the dark street. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone truly wanted to know her. Days passed, and James kept coming back to the diner. Always at the same time, always sitting in the same spot. He never asked for a menu or ordered anything extravagant. He would simply look at Emily with a small smile and say, "What do you recommend today?" At first, she found it strange. But over time, she realized this was more than just a meal. James wasn't coming for dinner. He was coming for something else, something he might not even be able to explain himself. That night, the diner was quieter than usual. Emily served James his food, and just as she was about to walk away, he spoke. "Would you sit with me for a minute?" She glanced around. Mike was in the kitchen, absorbed in his phone, and the manager had already left. "Just a minute," she said reluctantly, taking a seat on the other side of the counter. James picked up a napkin, twisting it between his fingers absent-mindedly. "Today was a rough day," he murmured. Emily studied his face. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced, his jaw tight with tension. He looked exhausted in a way that no amount of money could fix. "Work problems." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Something like that. Sometimes, I wonder if any of this is even worth it." This? He took a deep breath. "The money, the meetings, the contracts. It feels like I'm always chasing something I can never quite reach." Emily bit her lip. "But you have everything you want, don't you?" James lifted his gaze to hers, and for a moment, The silence between them was almost tangible. Not everything. That answer did something to her, something she couldn't quite name. Before she could process what it meant, he looked away. "And you? How was your day?" Emily shrugged. "Same as always. Working, trying to keep everything balanced." "Balancing what?" She hesitated. "My son, Noah." James blinked, surprised. It was the first time she had mentioned him. "You have a son?" Emily nodded. "He's 5. He's the best part of my life. And the hardest, too." James didn't ask about the father. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. "He's lucky to have you." She let out a short laugh. "I'm the lucky one." The clock on the wall was nearing midnight. Emily realized she had never talked this much with a customer before. "I think I've distracted you long enough," she said, standing up. James watched her for a moment before replying. "I needed this." Emily didn't know what to say. She simply picked up his empty plate and walked back to the kitchen, feeling her heart beating harder than it should. The following week, James kept coming back to the diner, and Emily started getting used to his presence. He always asked questions about her, about Noah, about her daily routine. But he never pushed when he sensed she didn't want to answer. That night, the diner was about to close when he walked in. Emily was already exhausted, but the moment she saw him, she felt an odd sense of relief. "I thought you weren't coming tonight," she said without thinking. James raised an eyebrow, a subtle smile on his lips. "Did you miss me?" She rolled her eyes, trying to ignore the warmth rising in her cheeks. "I just thought it was unusual. You've been pretty punctual." He chuckled and took his seat. "I had a complicated day. Needed to take care of a few things." Emily nodded and went to get his usual order without him having to say a word. When she returned, she found James staring out the window, his gaze distant. "Are you all right?" she asked, surprised by her own concern. James turned away from the street and looked at her. "Yeah, I was just thinking about how some things happen without explanation." Emily furrowed her brow. "What do you mean?" He played with the napkin in his hand before answering. "I wasn't supposed to come here that night. My plan was to have dinner at an expensive restaurant across town. But something made me change my mind. And now here I am." A shiver ran down her spine. "And do you think that means something?" James held her gaze for a long moment before replying. "I think it does." The silence between them stretched, heavy with something Emily didn't want, or perhaps didn't dare to name. Before she could respond, Mike called out from the kitchen, announcing he was heading out. James finished his meal, paid as he always did, and stood up. "Good night, Emily." And then he left, leaving her with a whirlwind of thoughts she didn't want to have. Emily was used to not talking about her past. It was easier that way. But James Donovan had a strange way of making her lower her guard, and that scared her. That night, the diner was almost empty when he arrived. He sat in his usual spot, and Emily quickly brought out his order. "You look tired," he observed. She sighed. "I'm always tired." James frowned, and before she could stop herself, she continued, "Working all day, taking care of a kid alone, trying to pay the bills. It all adds up. But there's no choice, right?" He was silent for a moment. Then, in a calm voice, he asked, "Noah's father never helped?" Emily froze. No one ever asked that question. Everyone just assumed she didn't want to talk about it. "No," she answered bluntly. James nodded, as if he had expected that response. "He just left." She let out a humorless laugh. "He walked away the moment he found out I was pregnant. Said he didn't want this life, that I was ruining our future. And so I stayed. Simple as that." James clenched his jaw. "Coward." Emily looked up at him, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But I did what I had to do." He held his coffee cup between his fingers, lost in thought. "My mother went through the same thing." Emily blinked. "What?" James took a deep breath. "My father was a powerful man, but he never wanted a family. When my mother got pregnant, he walked away and never looked back. She raised me and my brother on her own. I know how heavy that burden can be." Emily didn't know what to say. For the first time, she felt that James understood her struggle in a way no one else ever had. He lifted his gaze to hers and said softly, "You're stronger than you think, Emily." She looked away, feeling her heart race. "I just do what needs to be done." James gave a faint smile. "And that says everything." She didn't know how to respond. Instead, she simply picked up his empty plate and walked back to the kitchen, a strange tightness forming in her chest. The routine at the diner was always the same, but ever since James started showing up, Emily realized that her nights didn't feel as heavy anymore. He listened, asked questions, and, above all, he didn't treat her like she was invisible. That night, James arrived later than usual. As he sat down, Emily noticed that he seemed restless. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. He smiled faintly, something like that. "But now it's better." She felt warmth rush to her cheeks and quickly looked away. James picked up the spoon, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly before speaking. "Emily, can I take you to dinner?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner? Yeah, somewhere outside of here. A nice restaurant where you don't have to serve anyone." She let out a nervous laugh. "James, I don't know. It doesn't have to be anything big. I just want to take you somewhere where, for once, someone takes care of you." Emily hesitated. The idea was tempting, but it felt wrong somehow. "I have a son. I can't just go out like that." "I know, and I'm not asking for anything that would disrupt your life. I just want to see you somewhere different." She bit her lip, uncertain. I'll think about it." James smiled, as if he already knew that. Deep down, she had made up her mind. "Do that." Emily picked up her notepad, trying to mask the storm raging inside her. She knew that saying yes meant opening a door she might not be able to close. Emily still wasn't sure if accepting James's invitation was a good idea. But when Friday arrived, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress she kept for special occasions. Noah was with the neighbor, and she had promised not to stay out too late. Even so, her heart pounded against her chest as she walked down the stairs of her small apartment building. James was waiting, leaning against a sleek black car. When he saw her, he smiled in a way that sent a strange warmth through her chest. "You look beautiful." She rolled her eyes, uncomfortable with the compliment. "Don't overdo it." He opened the car door for her, and when they stepped into the elegant restaurant, Emily immediately felt out of place. The atmosphere was refined, soft lighting, instrumental music. James, however, looked completely at ease. "Has anyone ever told you that you don't need to impress anyone?" She teased, trying to cover her nerves. He smiled. "I'm not trying to impress. I just wanted you to experience something different." Emily took a deep breath and picked up the menu, but James didn't seem all that interested in the food. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his gaze. He hesitated before replying. "I was thinking about what you said the other day, about not having a choice." She fell silent. "Did you want a different life?" Emily lowered the menu. "Of course I did. But wanting doesn't change anything." James rested his elbows on the table. "Maybe it does." She let out a quiet laugh. "Not everyone can just decide to do something different." He held her gaze for a moment before asking, "Have you ever thought about trying?" Emily looked away. She didn't want to admit that, deep down, she had dreamed of it before. But dreams didn't pay the bills. She walked out of the restaurant that night feeling like she had crossed a dangerous line. James had been the perfect gentleman, keeping the conversation light and making sure she felt comfortable. But as much as she had enjoyed it, something inside her screamed not to get involved. When they arrived at her building, he turned off the car and looked at her. "Thank you for saying yes to tonight." She nodded, hesitant. "It was a different kind of night." He smiled. "I hope it was a good one." Emily looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on her. James, this... She took a deep breath. I don't know if this is a good idea. His smile faded slightly. Why not? She bit her lip, carefully choosing her words. Because we come from different worlds. You have everything. I can barely pay my bills. And more than anything, I have Noah. He comes first. James studied her for a moment before replying. I know he comes first, and I don't want to change that. Emily felt her heart tighten. But I can't afford to dream, James. I have responsibilities. I can't get lost in something that might lead nowhere. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. And what if it's already leading somewhere? She didn't know how to answer. All she knew was that the closer she got to James, the more afraid she felt. Emily opened the car door and hurried out without looking back. She couldn't allow herself to feel anything for him, because if she did, she'd have so much more to lose. In the days that followed, Emily tried to put distance between them. She avoided thinking about him, avoided wondering what might have happened if she had answered differently. But as always, he showed up at the diner. This time, though, he didn't come empty-handed. As Emily approached to take his order, she noticed a small bag sitting on the counter. What's this? She asked, wary. James pushed the package toward her. For Noah. Emily blinked, caught off guard. What? Just a little gift. She hesitated before opening the bag. Inside was a red toy car, meticulously detailed and gleaming under the diner's lights. Her chest tightened. James, I can't accept this. Yes, you can. He's going to love it. But... She took a deep breath. You don't have to do this. James held her gaze. I know, but I wanted to. A lump formed in Emily's throat. No one had ever cared like this, not even Noah's own father. She slowly closed the bag. Thank you. James smiled, and in that moment, Emily realized just how deep she had gotten into this, and that terrified her even more. That night, she came home with Noah's gift still clutched in her hands. She felt the weight of James's gesture, but also the fear that she was letting herself get too close. Noah loved the toy car. His eyes lit up as he rolled it across the floor, laughing excitedly. Emily smiled at the sight of his happiness, but an unease still lingered inside her. The following night, as she was leaving the diner, a shiver ran down her spine when she heard a familiar voice. Look who's still stuck in the same place. Her heart pounded. She turned around and found Tyler, Noah's father, leaning against a street lamp, wearing that same smug grin. What are you doing here? She asked, her stomach twisting. Just stopping by to see how my family is doing. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. You don't have a family here, Tyler. He stepped forward. Come on, Emily. No need to be hostile. Maybe I want to meet my son. After 5 years? The disdain in her voice was unmistakable. What do you really want? He sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. A little cash wouldn't hurt. Emily crossed her arms. You're not getting anything from me. Not from you, he said with a crooked smirk. But I hear there's a rich guy in the picture. Emily's blood ran cold. Don't you dare drag James into this. Tyler let out a low chuckle. Relax. I'm just curious to know if he realizes what he's getting himself into. Emily felt anger boil inside her. Get out of here, Tyler. If you show up again, I'm calling the police. He raised his hands in mock surrender, still smirking. All right, but I'm sure we'll run into each other again. And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Emily with a bitter taste in her mouth and a gnawing sense of danger. For the next few days, Emily remained on high alert, dreading the possibility of Tyler coming back. She didn't want to drag James into this, but she knew he would eventually notice her unease. That night, when James walked into the diner, he immediately frowned as soon as he saw her. What happened? Emily tried to play it off. Nothing. Just a rough day. He didn't buy it. Emily. She took a deep breath, knowing there was no point in lying. Tyler showed up, James froze for a moment. Noah's father? She nodded. He wants money, and he knows about you. James's jaw tightened. Did he threaten you? Indirectly, but I know Tyler. He always comes back when he needs something. James rested his elbows on the counter. His gaze locked onto hers. If he bothers you again, tell me. Emily shook her head. This isn't your problem. I can handle it. Not when it involves you and Noah. The intensity in his gaze made her heart race. James, I don't want you to get involved in this. He took a deep breath before saying, I already am. A tightness formed in Emily's chest. There was something final about that statement. Something that scared her just as much as it reassured her. She knew she was fighting against something that might already be inevitable. Emily tried to convince herself that she could handle Tyler on her own. But the truth was, his presence haunted her. At any moment, he could come back and cause trouble. James noticed her tension. That night, after dinner, he didn't leave right away. Come with me, he said, extending his hand. She hesitated. Where? I just want to show you something. Emily glanced around. The diner was already closing, and Mike could lock up. For some reason, she trusted James. They got into his car and drove to a park lit by low street lamps. The city felt far away here. The air was calm, free from the weight of everyday struggles. Why did you bring me here? She asked. James turned to face her. Because I want you to know you don't have to carry everything alone. She looked away. I always have, but now you have someone to share the weight. Emily felt her heart race. James leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. I care about you, Emily. About you and Noah. This isn't something temporary for me. She swallowed hard. James, I'm scared. So am I. He gave her a small smile. But for the first time, I'm willing to face that fear. Emily felt her eyes sting. It had been so long since anyone had chosen her like this. And maybe she had already chosen James, too. After that night in the park, something inside Emily had shifted. James wasn't just a customer or a fleeting distraction. He was willing to be there, to stand beside her, even when she tried to push him away. But doubt still gnawed at her. The next day, as she folded napkins at the counter, her coworker Sarah leaned in with a knowing smile. So, who's the mysterious man that comes here every night? Emily rolled her eyes. Just a customer. Sarah raised an eyebrow. The customer who looks at you like you're the only person in the world? Emily sighed. He's different, but I don't know if I can trust this. Sarah crossed her arms. And why not? Because people like him don't end up with people like me. Sarah took her hand for a brief moment. And what if he's the exception? Emily didn't answer, because deep down, she wanted to believe James was different. And that scared her more than anything. Emily spent the night tossing and turning, her mind tangled with doubts. But deep down, she already knew the answer. For the first time in years, someone saw her, beyond the exhaustion, beyond the responsibilities. The next morning, she gathered her courage and sent James a message. Can we meet today? His reply came almost instantly. Always, later that evening, at the park where everything had changed, Emily found him waiting for her. James watched her carefully, as if he knew something important was about to be said. She took a deep breath. I want to try. James was silent for a moment, as if letting each word sink in. Then, a gentle smile appeared on his face. Are you sure? Emily nodded. I'm still scared, but I think you're worth the risk. He took a step closer, his grip firm as he took her hand. I promise I'll never give you a reason to doubt that. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth of his touch. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was possible. Days turned into weeks, and Emily began to realize that James was true to his word. He wasn't just present, he made it a point to show in every gesture that he wanted to be there with her and with Noah. One sunny afternoon, They went together to pick Noah up from school. The boy ran toward his mother but stopped short when he noticed James standing beside her, his small forehead creasing with curiosity. "Who's he?" Noah asked, gripping Emily's hand tightly. She knelt down to his level, exchanging a quick glance with James before answering. "This is James, a very special friend." James smiled and knelt down in front of the boy. "Hey Noah, your mom told me you like cars." Noah's eyes lit up. "I have a bunch." James chuckled. "Then maybe one day you can show me." The boy thought for a moment, then without hesitation, reached for James's hand, accepting his presence as if it had always been there. Emily watched the scene unfold, a warmth spreading inside her. For the first time, there was no fear, only the certainty that, against all odds, she was no longer alone, and maybe she never would be again.